Well, hello there. Phil here from the Blue Envelope channel. Today I thought we could talk about the life and times of Theodore Ted Jaracz. Ted Jaracz was a member of the governing body of Jehovah's Witnesses from 1974 until his death in 2010 at the age of 84. Now you might ask, why discuss the life of a governing body member who's already come and gone? Why not talk about the guys there right now? Well, depending how deeply into the XJW scene you are, you may or may not know that, well, first of all, you'll probably know that the Watchtower Society keeps very close records on judicial cases, and that would also include accusations of child sexual abuse. Those records nowadays are all computerized, they're kept on a database, and the Society guards access to this database very aggressively. There was one instance earlier in the 2010s during a court case that they were paying a daily fine to the court instead of grant the court access to its records. Well, ex-Jehovah's Witnesses have long felt that beyond just the obvious reasons for refusing to disclose these records, one reason the database is guarded so closely is because there are some names of high-up Jehovah's Witnesses in the database. Specifically, that there is a governing body member named in it as a pedophile, and more specifically, that governing body member is Ted Jaracz. So that makes him very interesting indeed. And so I just thought we could see what we can find out about him. It's actually a little bit tricky because, for whatever reason, Ted Jaracz never had a life story, an autobiography published in the Watchtower magazine. And that in itself is quite unusual. Virtually all governing body members over the years have had their story published. But regardless, we'll do our best, even without that, to examine the life and history of Ted Jaracz. Well, to start off with, he was born September 28th, 1925 in Pike County, Kentucky. This is a quite rural area. It's near the border of Kentucky, Virginia, and West Virginia. And we find that he was baptized at 15 years old on August 10th, 1941. He was the only one in his family to become one of Jehovah's Witnesses. A couple years after he was baptized, he began regular pioneering at age 17 in 1943. And then in 1946, at 20 years old, he was invited to attend the 7th class of Gilead in South Lansing, New York at Kingdom Farm. He graduated in July that year, and his first assignment was to be a traveling overseer in the Cleveland, Ohio area. So 20 years old and a circuit overseer. That's pretty precocious. About 5 years later, in 1951, at 25 years old, he was assigned to be the branch servant of the country of Australia. He would do that for about 5 years and then return to the United States. So this is one key point that we want to check out a little bit in Ted Jaracz's story, his seemingly short stint as branch overseer in Australia. So he's sent over there, and then just 5 years later, it seems like he's suddenly removed from the country, reassigned back to America. The implication being that he left the country in disgrace, perhaps got into trouble over there, and was demoted back down to a regular pioneer for a time. And really, in fact, I was already preparing this video with that narrative in mind. But then I started reading the 1983 yearbook, which is where the history of witnesses in Australia is found. And what you find is that actually being the top witness in Australia, the branch servant, has often been a wild and crazy ride over the years. And that his 5-year stint was actually average, if not actually slightly above average, the time period that branch overseers lasted in Australia. So I thought we could take a couple of minutes just to kind of go through Australia's branch overseers over the years and see how long each one of them lasted. So we start out in 1904 when the branch office first opened in Melbourne, Australia. And the first overseer was E.C. Henninges, and he lasted about 5 years. In 1908, there was a lot of upheaval in the organization, and he ended up leaving and taking 80 out of 100 of the members in the ecclesia with him there. So he was gone, and he was replaced by R.E.B. Nicholson. He lasted about 8 years, from 08 to 1916. Now, in 16, Charles Russell died, and again there was upheaval and factions in the organization. Nicholson was in the anti-Rutherford camp. His wife, on the other hand, was in the Rutherford camp, and it seems like their marriage split up over it. But again, this branch servant left the Bible students, and most of the ecclesia came with him again. He was replaced by an Ebb Brewster. He only lasted about 1 year as branch overseer, and then he was replaced by William Johnston, and he actually lasted about 12 years from 1918 to 1930. It was during this time that the branch office moved from Melbourne over to Sydney. He was replaced in 1930 by Alexander McGillivray, and he also lasted about 12 years as the branch overseer in Australia. It was also during this time that Lloyd Berry was in Australia. He would later be on the governing body. He died in 1942, and he was replaced by one of the Bethelites there named Philip Rees. Philip lasted about 5 years. In 1946, he was reassigned to attend Gilead, and then the society would never have him return to Australia again. He was replaced by Laurie Wills. Laurie Wills only lasted about 1 year as branch overseer, and then the society replaced him with Floyd Garrett. He lasted roughly 3 years, and then he was pulled out of the country and reassigned to the United States. He was replaced by Roy Moyle, 1950 to 1951, again, only about a year. And then he was pulled out of the country by the society and reassigned to go to Gilead. And he's replaced by Ted Jaracz in 1951 to 1956. Again, he lasted about 5 years, and then he's pulled out of the country and reassigned to the U.S. His replacement was Douglas Held. He lasted about 8 years, 1956 to 1964. And the society pulled him out of the country and went back to the U.S. to attend Gilead and then in Canada. He was replaced by John Wilson, 1964 to 1981, so about 17 years. He was actually the longest-lasting branch overseer. And it was during his time period that they switched over to a branch committee arrangement. And while he did remain as branch coordinator of the committee, that was actually the end of the branch overseer arrangement. So, interestingly, the yearbook actually kind of comments on this rapid turnover of men in high assignments in Australia. On page 113, it says, interestingly, quite a number of brothers who served as circuit overseers and in other capacities in Australia later became branch overseers or coordinators in various parts of the world. Brothers such as Robert Lazenby, who served in New Zealand, Maxwell Lloyd in Paraguay, Donald Clare in Fiji, Douglas King in Sri Lanka, Harvey Logan in Taiwan, William Carney and later Kenneth Ganaway in Hong Kong, Ronald Jaka in Indonesia, Norman Bellotti in Singapore, Joseph Jenkins in Cyprus, Keith Young in Pakistan, Alfred Wick in Malaysia, Lloyd Berry in Japan, James Smith in Papua New Guinea, and Glenn Finlay in the Solomon Islands. It's almost as if the Watchtower Society in Brooklyn viewed Australia as kind of a good training ground for brothers. They'd send them out there, get their legs under them for a few years, and then pull them out to be used in other positions around the world. So, while Ted Jarracz's time in Australia at 5 years wasn't tremendously long for sure, it's definitely in line with how long most others were assigned in that role, and actually he outlasted a fair number of the branch overseers. So I guess simply looking at the length of his assignment there, I don't think we can say his manner of leaving Australia is suspicious. The yearbook has a little bit to say about his time as branch overseer. On page 104, it says, soon afterward, Theodore Jaracz was sent to Australia as branch overseer. He greatly encouraged the brothers throughout the country by his zeal for theocratic orderliness and a fine lead in the field. He often took the opportunity to serve circuit assemblies reasonably close to the branch office in the role of district overseer. And then there's one other section on page 108. It says, Western Australia had always had a much higher number of publishers in proportion to population than the other states. When Brother Theodore Jaracz was branch overseer, he made an announcement at one of the Perth district assemblies that was to become almost,
wait for it,
legendary. Speaking directly to the spiritually prosperous and expanding West Australians, he said, "You make 'em and we'll take 'em." This saying really caught on, and brothers and sisters from all parts of Western Australia responded marvelously to this call for assistance. To this day, many of those who answered the call to step over and help us from the West are filling key positions of responsibility in eastern cities and towns where congregations have developed from barren soil. Ted Jaracz would return in a slightly different capacity to Australia down the road. In 1989, he was actually the zone overseer over the branch committee in Australia, and he visited Australia that year. At any rate, in 1956, he returned to the U.S. at about age 31, and in December of that year, he married his wife, Melita Lasko. So let's check out Melita's story a little bit. Fortunately, her life story was published in the Watchtower on September 15th, 2015. Melita was born in 1927 in Waukesha, Saskatchewan in Canada, so she's about 2 years younger than Ted. She's one of 7 children. In 1933, her family converted to Jehovah's Witnesses. She was baptized in 1942 at age 15, like Ted. And like Ted, she started pioneering after high school. She eventually took a 6-month hairdressing course, and that's how she supported herself during her pioneering. She worked 2 days a week as a hairdresser. Well, skipping forward, in 1955, Nathan and Audrey Knorr visit Vancouver for an assembly. And with her hairdressing experience, Melita was assigned to give Audrey Knorr a free hairstyling. Well, when Nathan saw it, he was quite impressed, and he wanted to meet the hairdresser. So during the conversation with Melita, she told him that she, like many witnesses in 1955, was going to be attending the convention in New York City and then going on to attend the convention in Nuremberg, Germany. And so Nathan Knorr invites her to stay at Bethel during her travels. And that is where she met Ted Jaracz for the first time. She writes,
"That trip changed my life. In New York, I met a young brother named Theodore Ted Jaracz. Shortly after meeting him, I was surprised when he asked me, 'Are you a pioneer?' I replied, 'No.' My friend Levon overheard this and interjected, 'Yes, she is.' Puzzled, Ted asked Levon, 'Well, who knows better, you or her?' I explained that I had been pioneering and intended to start again as soon as I returned from the conventions."
So I just thought that was an interesting little anecdote that out of 80-some years of experiences, this is evidently one of the top 3 or 4 anecdotes about Ted Jaracz that evidently really captures the essence, the personality of the man. To me, he seems to come across as maybe a little brusque here, but it's hard to say. So this is 55. Ted had been in Australia about 4 years at this point as the branch servant. He was back in New York City in Nuremberg. He was going to attend the conventions as well. And so basically he and Melita hit it off. They hung out together during the conventions and essentially started dating at this point. Well, a few months later, Ted ends his assignment in Australia, returns to the United States, and shortly after moves to Vancouver to pioneer and to date Melita. Now, we know that Nathan Knorr, after he himself got married, was actually rather interested in the love lives of his friends. I'm not sure if he saw himself as a bit of a matchmaker, but we do see that he would reassign people in full-time service specifically so they could date and get married. So we saw that if you saw my video on the Schroeders. He did that for Albert Schroeder and his wife. And we see that here again with Ted and Melita, that he ends his branch overseer assignment so that he can go live near Melita. Now, Melita writes about her family meeting Ted. She says,
"I was happy to see how much my family liked him. My older brother, Michael, was very protective of me, and he often expressed concern if a young brother took an interest in me. However, Michael quickly became fond of Ted. 'Melita,' he said, 'you've got a good man here. You had better treat him well and be smart enough not to lose him.'"
So here another Ted Jaracz anecdote, evidently again one of the most outstanding ones in Melita's life. And we see this interaction between a man and a woman, Jehovah's Witness, her older brother here, and just this idea that if the relationship were to end for some reason, it must have been because Melita messed something up. There's nothing that Ted could have done wrong. Even if there were red flags that alarmed her for some reason about him, it was the woman's part to make this thing work no matter what. She needed to make him ask her to marry him by any means necessary. And interestingly, this idea is told to her by her older brother, who ostensibly was her main protector here. So it's just kind of something how the power differential between men and women among Jehovah's Witnesses really hasn't changed too much over the decades. At any rate, Melita and Ted got married in December 10th, 1956. They initially pioneered together in Vancouver there. Then they moved to California. And then they started the circuit work together in Missouri and Arkansas initially. They were in the circuit work for a number of years and eventually got promoted or transitioned to the district work. Another thing that happened somewhere between 1956 and 1974 was that Ted starts partaking of the emblems and changes from being one of the great crowd to being anointed. Melita writes,
"Some years after we got married, Ted explained to me that he was going to start partaking of the emblems at the memorial. I have prayed about this intensely to be absolutely sure that I am doing what Jehovah wants me to do," he said.
So it's interesting to me to read that there appears to have been some uncertainty on his part initially as to whether he was anointed or not. And it took him a period of time for him to conclude that, yes, I am now an anointed person, because he was praying intensely for some certainty about this. And I guess my thought is, well, you only pray for something that you don't have yet. I'm thinking of maybe a young witness couple who's praying to get pregnant. But once they get pregnant, they're not still praying to get pregnant. That wouldn't make any sense. So Ted here, he's praying for absolute certainty, for some sort of spiritual confirmation, evidently because he did not have absolute certainty, and he needed to get that from God. So it's an interesting little glimpse into how somebody becomes anointed. What makes it even more interesting is a talk that Stephen Lett of the current governing body gave, and it was published to jw.org in March of this year. And in that talk, he discussed how a person knows whether or not they're anointed.
So if his powerful Holy Spirit bears witness with a person, he is not going to communicate, "Maybe you have been called to heavenly life," leaving the person in doubt, a dilemma, a quandary. No, it is going to be an absolute affirmative communication, leaving the person with no question in his mind or heart. So if a person is wondering if he is anointed or not, the answer is obvious, isn't it? He is not.
So Stephen here seems to be saying that if there is any uncertainty about whether you're anointed or not, well, that proves that you're not anointed. It's interesting to consider the timeline here. So Stephen Lett joined the governing body in 1999, and as a result, he worked alongside Ted Jaracz. They were colleagues for about 10 years on the governing body. Ted dies in 2010. In 2015, Melita's life story discussing Ted is published. And then in 2021, Lett gives this talk. So I guess the question is he merely addressing the steady increase in the number of anointed witnesses each year, which is so bewildering to Jehovah's Witnesses since it kind of contradicts all the theology? Or does he have Ted in mind when he's giving this talk? Is he starting to lay some groundwork that, let's say some damaging information were to come out on Ted, the governing body can say he was not actually anointed after all? They can retcon him. It's hard to say. Now let's talk in the daily text together, which were for March 27th, 2021, which was the day of the memorial this year. Those were themselves based on a January 2020 Watchtower study article. Interestingly, despite what I'm sure is his busy schedule, this study article was read personally by another governing body member, in fact, the member from Australia, Jeffrey Jackson. And notice what he reads in paragraph 14.
In fact, if you are wondering whether you have been anointed by Holy Spirit, such doubt in itself would mean that you have not been. Those called by Jehovah do not wonder whether they have been anointed or not. They know.
So I think, again, it could be fair to ask, is the current governing body preparing for the possibility of disavowing a earlier governing body member? Hard to say. Well, at any rate, once Ted declares himself as anointed, that opens up the possibility to join the governing body. And as you might imagine, for an anointed district overseer, sure enough, he was invited to join the governing body in 1974 after about 18 years in the traveling work. Now, I won't go into much detail about his time on the governing body. He did all the governing body stuff. If you'd like to know more, I would encourage folks to check out the book Crisis of Conscience by Raymond Franz. Raymond and Ted served together on the governing body for a number of years, and so he has details about Ted in his book. As well as that, Barbara Anderson has written a biography about Ted Jaracz on her website, and that's kind of helpful because she was in Bethel for many years and sort of has all the rest of the story on folks there, as well as also she is very familiar with the child protection policies of the Watchtower Society. Well, like many Americans, Ted Jaracz had a lot of trouble with high blood pressure, and it ended up in 2007 that he had a large stroke from that, which evidently left his right side almost paralyzed completely initially, although his speech was not affected. He was able to regain a lot of function with physical therapy. But in 2010, he had another big stroke, and that actually was what he died from. That was June 9th, 2010, at age 84. Now, I want to dial back the timeline a little bit. We'll go back to 2002. 2002 was quite a rough year for the Watchtower Society, although as an active Jehovah's Witness, I had no idea. I was happy living in my little Jehovah's Witness, my little JW bubble, where I never heard anything about bad things about the society, and none of my friends, we never talked about anything that might be bad about it. So, but outside the bubble, there were two damning documentaries that came out that year. One was in the United States on May 28th, 2002. It was with the news show Dateline. And it was a show about the way the society's policies handled child sexual abuse. It was titled Witness for the Prosecution. And then a couple months later in the UK, the news show Panorama on July 14th published a show along the same lines. Their title was Suffer the Little Children. Now, the producers of the Panorama show had wanted somebody from the society to come on camera to discuss with them how the organization handles child abuse allegations, and as normal, the society had refused. So it ended up that the Panorama crew actually traveled to a convention in Tulsa, Oklahoma, because there was a governing body member there giving talks for the convention. And they talked to him, and that member was Ted Jaracz. Let's see how it went.
So it was back to America and back to a Jehovah's Witness convention in Tulsa. We'd been told we'd find a member of the governing body here. Ted Jaracz is one of the men responsible for the church's child protection policy. For more than 2 months, we've been asking them for an interview. We want answers to some simple questions. Why do they keep their database of suspected paedophiles secret? Why don't they report all allegations of abuse to the police? Why do they send children back to the arms of their abusers? They refused to talk to us, but here at last, we had our chance.
Tell me about the database. How do you justify keeping a list of people, men in some cases, who have confessed to paedophilia, but you have not reported them to the authorities? What justification is there for you to keep that?
You have a privacy law. You have a directive from the European Union You observe that, don't you?
So when allegations of abuse are made, it's all right to keep them private?
I think you were answered. That question was answered to your satisfaction.
Can you answer it now?
I'm not going to repeat. I'll just tell you exactly that you can go and you see it in writing. It's all in faith. You know, the Bible says, do not go beyond the things that are written. We don't go beyond the things that are written.
And that was that.
Let's move this way, please.
No doubt, no second thoughts. Just a simple belief that Jehovah will sort it out. A belief for which others, younger and more vulnerable, may continue to pay a price.
So those there are the only publicly available comments we really have from Ted Jaracz on how the society handles child sexual abuse. Not a whole lot of detail there. On September 27th of 2002, there was a vigil or a march, a protest held outside Brooklyn Bethel. And this was organized by a group called Silent Lambs. That was a group organized by Bill Bowen in the early 2000s. And it served to bring together JW survivors of child abuse and bring attention to this issue. Bill Bowen was a former elder himself who had gotten frustrated or disgusted with the way the society handled or mishandled child abuse. And I think he was really one of the main drivers in getting some of those documentaries made at that time. I don't believe the group's really active anymore, but at the time it was a pretty notable force in this arena. And so they held this event on September 27th, right outside Brooklyn Bethel, and they had a stuffed animal lamb for each child abuse survivor that was represented there. And all these lambs, many, many lambs, were laid outside the Bethel buildings. And as well as that, various abuse survivors spoke and shared their experiences. I think, incidentally, that the fact that folks could have such highly visible protests like this right outside Bethel in New York City was probably one of the many reasons the society was eager to move out of the city and now has their headquarters on a deserted country road. But the name Ted Jaracz comes up a couple of times during this event, and so we'll look at two clips recorded that day. First, we'll hear from a gentleman named Charles Riley.
This is Charles Riley from New York. I just wanted to say that I'm here in support of everyone here. And I also wanted to say that I'm here in support of my niece in California because in 1984, she was molested on 3 different occasions by one of the brothers in our congregation in Tahunga, California. And when my sister went to the elders to get it straightened out, they refused to do anything about it. She sent a letter to the governing body and they wrote her back stating they were not going to get involved. And this brother, this so-called brother, went to another congregation and molested 2 other young ladies. So I'm here in support of her. And I also wanted to say, I was an elder for 7 years. And I know for a fact that they've instructed elders not to go to the police when it comes to child abuse. And I also wanted to mention that although all of the governing body members and the Watchtower officials share the blame, one of the main culprits is Theodore Jaracz. He is the main culprit. He has to pay. And we are not going to stop until justice is done for all of our children and all of us who've been abused by this organization. Next is Deborah.
So remembering the timeline, this event comes just a few months after the Dateline and the Panorama shows had aired. And we kind of see that people were zeroing in on Ted Jaracz as sort of being the public face of Watchtower's child sexual abuse policies. So he mentions him there. Next, we'll hear from a woman named Pat Garza.
I'm Pat Garza, and I'm here to say that I was raped by Theodore Jaracz. When I was a little girl, I was living in Los Angeles, and he was the district servant. There are 2 boys emergency ward because of what the elders did to me. And then I was hospitalized for months because I had nowhere to go. I was homeless. They threw me out in the street. I was destitute and I was disabled. I was unable to work because of the flashbacks I was having. And I ended up on the street, and I have with me a photocopy of the letter that the elders, the entire body of elders sent me. It has all of their names on it. It says that they called the Watchtower Society here in New York and asked for how to help me. And they sent me a list of homeless shelters, and I have a list of homeless shelters. One of them was Burnside Projects on Skid Row in Portland, Oregon. Two of them were churches. One was Care to Share, which is based in a Lutheran church in Beaverton, Oregon, and the other was the YWCA. The humiliation that I felt was beyond belief. I almost died when I got that letter from those elders, and I almost stopped praying. The Watchtower Society has stood as a block between children and their God. All they do is destroy a person's faith and hope and make us feel like God does not love us. And I'm here to say that He does. And I'm saying for those of us who are victims of satanic ritual abuse in this organization by some of these elders and by Ted Jaracz, it's safe to come out now. And you can come and talk. And I'm begging anybody who knows MD and MW, I would say their names, but for privacy, I won't reveal them. But Silent Lambs knows, and so I'm begging for MD and MW who are there to please call Silent Lambs at 1-877-WT-ABUSE. Please step forward and be my witnesses. Thank you.
Love you. Therefore, your past. We love you. Thank you for coming forward. Thank you.
Okay, why don't we deliver the lamb?
So that was Pat Garza. Clearly, she had been through a lot in her life, and our hearts go out to her. My understanding is that she died the following year from cancer. And I would imagine that even just being able to share your thoughts openly like that had to have been cathartic. If you are a ex-GW or ex-Mormon, one of the best parts of leaving is not having to weigh everything you say before you say it, to consider if somebody will be stumbled or you'll get counseled about it, that kind of thing. So this event was such a great idea from that standpoint. You can see Barbara Anderson was there, and she hugs Pat at the end of her testimony. So I want to zero in on a couple of things that Pat says. She says, first of all, I was raped by Theodore Jaracz when I was a little girl. I was living in Los Angeles, and he was the district servant.
And I'm here to say that I was raped by Theodore Jaracz. When I was a little girl, I was living in Los Angeles. And he was the district servant.
So that's the main accusation there. And we do know, as we saw, that he did live in California, and he was a district overseer. Now, shortly after that, you notice she says, when I started to remember the abuse.
And when I started to remember the abuse, I was abused horrifically in the congregation.
So what we're talking about here are repressed memories that had been recovered. And then thirdly, right near the end, she says, and I'm saying for those of us who were victims of satanic ritual abuse in this organization, find some of these elders and find Ted Jaracz. It's safe to come out now. I can't quite tell if she's saying find or fight or bind. Let's listen to it.
And I'm saying for those of us who are victims of satanic ritual abuse in this organization by some of these elders and by Ted Jaracz, it's safe to come out now.
So this is taking us into a new area, and the belief that satanic ritual abuse was being practiced in the highest levels of the Watchtower Society, in this case by a district overseer in California. And although Pat initially had no memory of these events, she was able to recover these repressed memories through various techniques in therapy. Now, concern or the issue of satanic ritual abuse was a thing which really swept through U.S. and British society. It began in 1980 when a book ostensibly describing the experiences of a victim was published. It was called Michelle Remembers, and that kicked off a huge concern or panic over satanic ritual abuse in the 80s and 90s. And many, I'm sure, well-meaning therapists used controversial techniques to help pull out and recover lost memories from children and adults of satanic ritual abuse they'd undergone in daycare centers, in churches, and even at the hands of their own parents. It's really beyond the scope of this video to delve into the subject in depth. It is a pretty in-depth subject. What we can say is that after years and years of investigations, there's actually never been a single case of satanic ritual abuse authenticated with actual physical evidence beyond that of repressed memories. I'd highly, highly encourage anyone interested in more info on the subject to watch on Mormon Stories, the YouTube channel. There was a series of videos done last year about satanic ritual abuse because the Mormon religion, like Jehovah's Witnesses, has also had many rumors and accusations from folks that high-level leaders are secretly practicing ritual abuse on children. And so the host there, he interviews a professor who literally wrote the book on the subject. He interviews as well a woman who experienced therapy, which used these techniques to pull out, to recover repressed memories of childhood abuse and her thoughts on that, years later. It's really a fascinating subject. So I guess the question, did Ted Jaracz practice satanic ritual abuse on children while he was a district overseer? I do think we need to have serious reservations about claiming that. Now, does he bear responsibility for witnessed children who have been sexually abused by people in the congregations? Yes, all governing body members do. The blame for policies which are designed first and foremost to protect the organization instead of children, ultimately that blame has to be laid at the feet of the men at the top. That's where the buck stops. In 2019, a civil lawsuit was filed against the Watchtower Society by two women childhood sexual abuse survivors named Lynn Hagan and Tara Bird. And in their suit, there's an interesting statement on page 8. It says, "Additionally, upon information and belief, a known child molester was appointed to the governing body in 1974, and he controlled Watchtower defendants' database of molesters, policies toward their judicial cases, and non-reporting to authorities until his death in 2010. So looking at those dates, it's evidently referring to Ted Jaracz here, and they refer to him as a known child molester with the qualifier upon information and belief. What does that phrase mean in a legal standpoint? Well, if we turn to good old Wikipedia, it tells us, in the law of evidence, the phrase information and belief identifies a statement that is made not from first-hand knowledge, but based on second-hand information that the declarant believes is true. The phrase is often used in legal pleadings, declarations under penalty of perjury, and affidavits under oath. It is often used in a phrase similar to, the plaintiff is informed and believes, and upon such information and belief alleges. This protects the maker of the statement from claims of outright falsehood or perjury. So essentially it's saying they had heard or been given to understand, and it seems correct to them, that Jaracz was a child molester. But is there any proof to back this up? Well, as the JW Watch article which discusses this lawsuit says, it is unclear whether the law firm of Bachetto and Lentz will present physical documentation to substantiate the allegations against Jaracz. Now, I myself haven't heard anything more on this lawsuit, so it remains to be seen if any evidence is forthcoming. So, perhaps we can sum up so far. 1. Does the length of the period of time Ted Jaracz spent in Australia indicate that he was pulled out in disgrace, possibly for child molestation there? Well, I would have to say no. Was he anointed? By his own account, yes, certainly. By the current governing body's standards, I'm not really sure. Was Pat Garza correct that he practiced satanic ritual abuse on her as a child in LA? Again, there's never been a single authenticated case of satanic ritual abuse in the U.S., so I would have to say no. So, was Ted Jaracz personally a pedophile? Not based on any information I currently have. Now, do others have proof that hasn't come out? It's certainly possible, but at the moment, we have no further information. If, as I hope is the case, he never abused any children, does he bear culpability for witness children that other witnesses abused? Yes. Yes, he does, as do all governing body members. A short article announcing his death appeared in the November 15th, 2010 Watchtower. The title of the article was, "The Things He Did Have Gone Right With Him." That references the final sentence in the article, which reads, "We're also certain that the things he did have gone right with him," which itself is paraphrasing Revelation 14:13, which says, "And I heard a voice out of heaven say, 'Right, happy are the dead who die in union with the Lord from this time onward. Yes,' says the Spirit, 'let them rest from their labors, for the things they did go right with them.'" So when it says go right with them, it's saying the things they've done go along with them. They follow them after their death. Or the Bible in Living English renders it, "for their deeds follow with them." And so with that in mind, I find this this is extremely ingenious, extremely clever way to sum up Ted Jaracz' life on the part of the Watchtower writers. I almost wonder if the writer was Pimo when this was published, because it really cuts both ways, doesn't it? The things he did go right with him, all the good deeds, yes. And also, if there were evil, heinous deeds that Ted Jaracz did, those also follow him straight into the afterlife, according to the Bible. You know, if you read the Bible and take it for what it says, the God of the Gospels really cares deeply for small children. In Matthew 18, verses 5 and 6, in the NIV, it says that Jesus told his followers, "And whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me. If anyone causes one of these little ones, those who believe in me, to stumble, it would be better for them to have a large millstone hung around their neck and to be drowned in the depths of the sea." So the stakes are very, very high for governing body members, really for any person taking the lead in an organization which claims to be led by Christ. And I don't know, I can't help but wonder if whoever chose the title of the article about the death of Ted Jaracz, the things he did have gone right with him, was also thinking about the verses a few chapters later in Revelation 21, verses 7 and 8. It says there, "Anyone conquering will inherit these things, and I will be his God, and he will be my son. But as for the cowards, and those without faith, and those who are disgusting in their filth, and murderers, and the sexually immoral, and those practicing spiritism, and idolaters, and all the liars, their portion will be in the lake that burns with fire and sulfur. This means the second death." Or, as Proverbs 10:7 puts it a bit more succinctly, "But the name of the wicked will rot." Well, that's about all I have to cover today. So thanks for watching. Subscribe if you'd like to, and we'll catch you all in the next video. Take care now.
So if a person is wondering if he is anointed or not, the answer is obvious, isn't it? He is not. He is not. He is not.